West Hill United is a progressive spiritual community where how you live is more important than what you believe. West Hill United is a people, a place, an idea. We are a community living out of a progressive faith, striving to make a positive difference in our own lives, the lives of others, and the world. Join us Sundays at 10:30 a.m. or connect with us at any time.
We have two readings this morning. The first is from then Prince Charles' speech at his investiture as Prince of Wales on July 1st, 1969. I know that social conditions have changed since 50 years ago, and of course are still changing. The demands on a Prince of Wales have altered, but I am determined to serve and to try as best I can to live up to those demands, whatever they might be, in the rather uncertain future. One thing I'm clear about, and it is that Wales needs to look forward without forsaking the traditions and essential aspects of her past. The past can be just as much a stimulus to the future as anything else. By the affirmation of your loyalty today, for which I express my gratitude, this will not simply be a faint hope, offered as wisdom for the journey. May we walk in it. The second reading is from Mehmet Murat, ildan, a contemporary Turkish playwright, novelist, and thinker. The real king of the jungle is not the lion. The real king of the jungle is the jungle itself. Being a king is not just about having power. To be a true king means to offer equal beauty and opportunities to all, to protect the subjects with love, just like a forest. Offered as wisdom for the journey. May we walk in light.
In the space between us, there must be a line set between you and me that keep the ideas we have of one another clear and constant. There must be a line, too, between before and now and after, and no doubt another one that runs between those two. And we should be able to find a line between here and there, between us and them, between light and heavy, cheap and too much, beautiful and not bad. And another line would be helpful were it drawn between now and forever. But please, 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 don't forget the one between possible and impossible. Without it, how will we know where to draw all the other lines? As those who clearly cross the line, we offer ourselves beyond definition. So as I mentioned earlier, I want to focus on the coronation today, on all that glitters and is beautiful, and perhaps invite us to think about some of the others. So I'm not going to go into detail with them. I'll leave that for you during the week. But I wanted to speak about it because it's an event that will be watched around the world. I mean, it will be on screens in every country, I expect. Probably even in the Arctic monitoring stations that used to email me when I worked in Inuvik, not email me, teletype me. When we monitored the NORAD symbols to make sure that there was no nuclear device flying over the Arctic toward us. The first thing that came to mind about it was, where did the name Charles come from? I remember in The Crown when Elizabeth says, and they say, well, what do you want to be called? And she says, what do you mean, what do I want to be called? What do you want to be called? What's your name, your regnal name going to be? And she goes, well, I think Elizabeth is fine. So she kept Elizabeth. But Charles could have changed his name, and may yet, as far as I know, but I think he is Charles. But when naming a royal baby, one would want to think about that, particularly if it's going to be the next King of England one day. You'd want to think about that name. And so I went to look at some of the other names that have been, kings called Charles, to find out who they were and what was perhaps running through the brains of his parents when they chose that name. So the first one, Charles I, the date of the name or the date of the coronation. Do you know what that is? That's the accession to the throne of George V when his father died, was on May 10th. And so that's when they've chosen this date. And George V was the one who changed the name of the house, so that it was no longer the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha house, which was changed in 1917 in the middle of the war, to the House of Windsor. And the House of Windsor has been understood and recognized now as one of the greatest monarchies of the British Empire, though it has dissolved most of the British Empire since that time, but it's recognized as one of the greatest houses of the monarchy, I suppose I should say. So Charles I believed in the right of kings, the divine right of kings, and that's the name of the prospectus today, is simply divine. The divine right of kings that God had actually given to the people, not the king, but to the people, the inspiration to acknowledge that the king was divine. And so that gave the king the divine right to do whatever should be done, because technically he was acting on behalf of the people, even if some of them were acting up and pretending they hadn't actually had that divine inspiration. So he did a lot of really sort of repugnant things in his time, because he always wanted to get his own way without regard to anything else that was going on in the realm. Even though, because he had this, it wasn't just that God had told him to do this, it was because God had told the people to tell him to do this, and so if he's doing this, it's because they want it, right? So he wasn't particularly well-liked, and actually was sort of run out of the palace, and then eventually executed, because he wanted to get his way a little too much, I guess. And so he was executed, and of course, who followed him? Oliver Cromwell. Completely sort of different setup for the state, right? So I think that if you think that everybody is telling you what to do through God, so you get your own way, maybe the next time it's just going to be people telling everybody what to do, right? There's not going to be the sort of God person in that place. But what happened was that he died. Cromwell died. And as many charismatic leaders, as happens to their movements when they die, if there hasn't been a way for that movement to become institutionalized in some way, it collapses. And that's, like a sentence long about what really happened after Oliver Cromwell died. And so they put Chuck II on the throne, right? So he came to the throne, and that was Charles I's son. Now, he had learned his lessons. He was not going to reign in the same way that Charles I had, because he wanted to keep his head, or however it was that the first one lost his life. Didn't go into that detail. And so he just had fun, right? His whole palace was constantly a time of partying and hedonism. He never actually had a child, a legitimate child that could take the throne, so it went to his brother James, but he had 12 illegitimate children from his various mistresses. So we went from the guy who was getting his own way all the time, to the guy who was just having a good time and carrying on. So I'm back in that room with Philip and Elizabeth, trying to come up with the name Charles. And somehow in between those two, they decided that he might be able to temper things a little bit. And so that's how he got the name Charles. I don't know. I'm not in conversation with them. So, they're dead now. But we can only guess at what that is. But some of the history of the Prince of Wales might give us a little insight into where that went wrong. So Charles was invested as the Prince of Wales in 1958, and that's one of the readings, was part of that investiture. How many of you watched The Crown? Oh my goodness, okay. Yes, we watched The Crown. You know what I mean, the show, The Crown. Fascinating. Haven't watched the last season. But in that show, they actually film the whole section of Charles giving that speech when he was being invested as the Prince of Wales. And they showed that the first half of the speech he actually said in Welsh. It had been pulled out of the University of Cambridge, I think it was, and sent to the university in Wales before that was to take place so that he could, get to know the people and stuff. But shockingly, he actually learned enough Welsh that he could read that first half of his speech in the tongue of the people for whom he was going to be the prince. And that's no small thing. I've got Welsh in me. My grandfather's name was Llywelyn, because that double L thing has got some kind of a breeze going through it, right? So trying to learn how to speak like that is not an easy thing, right? So he became the Prince of Wales, starting off with this incredible language. But the person who taught it to him was Edward Milbank. And Edward Milbank was a professor at the University of Wales, and he was chosen to be the tutor for Prince Charles. Now, some of that is on The Crown, and you see that, there's this little bit of, is he getting, are they turning him over to the Welsh side, right? Like, is this person going to turn our son and make him into a radical? And there's all this undertones that people weren't happy with the speech because it was suggesting that, maybe he would be siding with the Welsh somehow, and that would be a bad thing. But I'm thinking it might be something even a little more concerning than that. So in 1957, there was a vote that took place about a town in Wales that was going to be flooded because Liverpool had run out of water. And so the members of Parliament, of the British Parliament, voted on whether to put a dam in that would flood this small town and provide water in Wales for the people in Liverpool, which is, of course, in England. And that vote took place in 1957, just the year before Charles was invested as Prince of Wales. And 35 out of 36 of the Welsh MPs of the British Parliament voted against it. There was a lot of ill feeling. It's a small town, 67 people, a church, a chapel, and a graveyard, and a school, and one of the few towns that still spoke Welsh as its primary language. That was the language of the community. So it was a deeply rooted political issue at that point in time. So rather than having concerns about Charles going to Wales and becoming indoctrinated in this kind of, counterculture of Welsh independence, instead, perhaps it was that Edward Milbank was attached to Charles in order to find something he liked about him so that Edward Milbank's activism would drop significantly over that period of months when he was shoulder to shoulder with Charles at that time. So the independence of Wales has continued to be a significant conversation that has taken place in the British Parliament for a long time and amongst the people of Wales. And some of the most recent uprisings have been, and protests have been fairly significant, bringing thousands of people out to argue for the independence of Wales. At the time, back when it was annexed, and Scotland as well, it was believed, well, they could never take care of themselves. But those countries have since become industrialized, have found their own strength and well-being, and so those conversations about independence of those are significant conversations, and it may be that perhaps Charles's time in Wales has given him some sympathies towards that, and perhaps under his leadership that might actually find that Wales can survive as an independent country on its own and sever its ties with the British monarchy. But my question that I wanted to explore beyond just that historical stuff and my own little political aggrandizements around, what the purpose of his trip and his scholar were, I wanted to think about these people as people down the street. And how would we interact with them if they were just people down the street? Just, the bloke and the lass that we walked by every couple of weeks, saw them and nodded to them and kept going. And I'm not saying just the bloke and the lass that are living down the street in the duplex that's the same as mine, but the bloke and the lass that are sitting down the street in a castle with a cottage castle somewhere else, and a few other significant places somewhere else, and the power to make decisions that can affect whole countries. I mean, there's mostly, in the Commonwealth, most of those countries have their own systems of government, but there's an incredible influence that the monarchy still has. So if we were in proximity to them, how would we feel about them? My father, years and years ago, wrote a poem and sent it to the Queen. It was like, I think, 3 or 4 verses, rhyming couplets, and sent it off to her. And the theme of it, which I never discussed with him because I didn't want to get into the argument. We had enough of those with this one. But the theme of the poem was how much harder it was for someone to ride the royal carriage than it was for the rest of us bloke on the street. So you can understand why maybe my dad and I didn't agree on that. Because I thought it was, I don't think that they have it that difficult. I don't think that the reigning elements of the monarchy are significant enough that they have an impact. So I don't know how I'd feel if I lived down the street from one of them and saw all that was going on. So I'm wondering, what would you think? I'll say it again. If somebody wants to add something, I'll repeat it so everyone will hear it. I won't say your name. I'm the only one being identified as an, non-monarchist or whatever I am. I'm not a non-monarchist. I mean, I love watching The Crown too. It's hard to imagine, actually, even being in such close proximity with that reality and drawing the distinctions between our access to resources, medical resources when we need them, support as we're aging when we need it, care for children, the feeding of the poor, the lack of access to family doctors these days, the lack of access to language education in some places of the country, the lack of support for differing people, all kinds of things. I could come up with all kinds of lists and recognize that those problems would disappear if I were the Queen. I mean, apparently I'd have other problems, but I think she solved most of them when she created the Commonwealth and let countries rule themselves. So I think those problems go away, and the monarch doesn't really get to interfere in Parliament very much, so those problems aren't theirs. So I think that we would perhaps harbor a resentment that here in Canada, we're so distant from, it doesn't really affect us, right? We don't think about it on a day-to-day basis. We don't see that discrepancy in any significant way. And we don't see the parliamentarians there in the same way that we see the parliamentarians here either. So I think that that's a significant difference. The second reading that I shared was one from a Turkish playwright. I lost that for a moment. And the president in Turkey is up for re-election. Erdogan has been there now for 20 years of leadership, a stiff composition, and the composition is, as it often is after a long time like that, a coalition of interests. And a coalition of interests, once elected, often falls apart and creates some kind of chaos. That can happen. So Erdogan is fighting for strength in that country. And Mehmet Murat is a playwright, and he wasn't writing to that story when he wrote this. He writes books and novels as well, but he wasn't writing to what's going on in Turkey right now. But his statement that the real king of the jungle is not the lion, the real king of the jungle is the jungle itself. Being a king is not just about having power. To be a true king means to offer equal beauty and opportunities to all. To protect the subjects with love, just like a forest. I had a video queued up, which we're not going to do because it's too difficult to meld it into everything else, but it's that little bit, if you haven't seen Monty Python, Quest of the Holy Grail, where they're talking about, damp women in ponds holding out a sword is no basis for a system of government, and they're having this conversation about socialism as the king is riding around without a horse, right, if you remember. And this seems to be about what that kind of a monarchy could be, the monarchy of the place that you are, right? That is what is bejeweled and bewitching and glittering and glamorous and dark and deep and secretive and messed up with life. That's maybe what true kingship or monarchy could be. And we are all part of that. We don't get to step aside from reality. Well, I'm sure I do sometimes, but we don't step aside from the way the world works. We don't step aside from our relationships just because, we feel they're beneath us from time to time. We don't step aside from our responsibilities to our community. We don't step aside from the responsibilities we have to coworkers or to colleagues. We don't step aside from the challenges that are facing us in the world. We don't step aside from what's happening with climate. We don't step aside with the fact that most economists don't realize that the economy is tanking. We don't step aside from reality. And if the king is the jungle in which we live, if the king is the environment in which we have to find our footing, in which we have to make our lives, if that's the true king, as Mehmet says, then don't we all have a say in how it plays itself out? Don't we all have the glory of living that out in our lives? Fingernails dirty and everything that it takes to achieve that. So as you watch the coronation, you can find that little clip about Monty Python on YouTube, but if you watch the coronation, as all this grand glittering takes place, and we get to sing "I Vow to Thee, My Country" again in the privacy of our own homes, I want you to feel that crown going on your head. I want you to feel, remember, Elizabeth's crown was 17 pounds. 17 pounds on your head. I have no idea what Chuck's going to wear, but 17 pounds. I want you to feel the weight of that. The weight of this world and all it can be resting upon your crown. I want you to feel like you live within the king, that you live within the monarchy, that you live within what may be. Thank you.
Become a sustaining champion of West Hill United's work by committing to an automatic monthly donation. Learn more or donate now through Canada Helps.